Hello again everybody, and welcome to step 6 of Glaciers and Glacial Geomorphology. In this step we're talking about the structure or the anatomy of glaciers. You've seen me a lot over the last few weeks drawing diagrams of glaciers where we've talked about things happening at the glacier surface in the interior and at the bed. Sometimes we've been talking about ice sheets and flow patterns through the ice and the interactions between the glacier and the substrate, or energy balance or mass balance processes going on at the surface. But we've never really taken time to talk explicitly about that structure or anatomy with different sections of the glacier in which different characteristics are dominant and in which different kinds of processes are going on. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit in this step, starting with the supraglacial zone and working our way through the glacier to the basal zone, which will give us an opportunity to start talking about some of the things that happen in glacial geomorphology, which is where the module is going over the next couple of weeks. So let's start at the top and talk about the supraglacial zone, or if you're American, the superglacial zone. But in English we'll say the supraglacial zone. That's a bit right at the top of the glacier. Some people say it is simply the exact upper surface itself. Other people say we can go down maybe 10, 20, 30 centimetres into the zone which is directly affected by things happening moment by moment at the surface. But it is just a very thin skin right at the top of the glacier. Beneath that we have typically a much thicker area that we refer to as the N-glacial zone, taking us down towards the basal zone, and in particular here people talk about, and we will talk about later on, the basal ice layer, in which the characteristics of the ice are different from the ice elsewhere in the glacier because they're conditioned by things that are happening at the bed and not controlled entirely by things happening at the surface in the interior. That basal ice layer, the basal zone, leads us down to the glacier bed, and below that we have the subglacial environment. And we've already said things about each of these different locations. So we've talked about subglacial deformation, we've talked about accumulation at the glacier surface. You've drawn for me stress, strain and velocity profiles through the N-glacial zone. So you are already familiar with these zones, with this structure, with this anatomy, but it's important that we say something explicitly about these layers at this stage before we move on to focus on what's happening at the glacier bed. Now, as well as a vertical structure, also at this stage, as we start thinking ahead to the geomorphology, I want you to think also about a horizontal structure or a geography of what happens where within glacier systems. So let's think about that as well. So since we're talking about structure, let's also think about geography. And we have our glacial environment, with the supraglacial, the N-glacial, the basal, the subglacial, etc. But then we have the edge of the glacier, or the margin, the ice marginal environment. The glacial, the ice marginal, and then in front of the glacier we talk about the proglacial environment. And we might talk about the proximal proglacial, near to the glacier, and the distal proglacial, further away from the glacier. We'll talk about that in more detail when we talk about sediment transfer through the glacier, when we talk about sediment transfer through the glacier. Now this is a time transgressive geography, so as the glacier advances and retreats, the position of the margin varies. What is proglacial or subglacial also varies. So at this point, this location here is proglacial. If the glacier was to advance, then that point would become subglacial, and it will go through a variety of stages, from being proglacial to being ice marginal to being subglacial, and if the ice retreats again it becomes marginal again. So you can begin to imagine a stratigraphy or a history building up of different environments at any one point over the course of time. So begin to think in 3 dimensions of the vertical structural characteristics of the glacier, remembering that what happens at the surface, certainly above the equilibrium line, gets progressively buried into the glacier and becomes end glacial and heads towards the basal zone. So as well as having a static structure, there's also a dynamic, a history of movement of that structure, inheritance of those characteristics from the surface into the interior of the glacier. Potentially also, and we'll talk about this in detail later on, think about, well, what's happening at the basal ice layer in terms of entrainment of sediment and entrainment of debris, and can we talk in the same way about this inheritance of structures from the superglacial zone into the englacial zone, or from the bed into the basal ice layer. So what we see in the englacial zone, if we extend that all the way towards the bed, is an inheritance of things happening at the surface or the base of the glacier. And likewise, in the post-glacial environment, when the glacier is completely gone and we're left with whatever the glacier leaves behind, the landforms, the sediments that the glacier has left behind, those landforms and sediments retain for us a history of what that glacier has done, how that glacier has impacted on the landscape, which depends partly on all the processes that are happening internally, particularly the dynamic processes which relate to what's happening at the surface, and particularly for the geomorphology, it's inherited from things that are happening at the bed of the glacier in terms of erosion, entrainment, transport of sediment and deposition of sediment from the bed of the glacier or at the margin of the glacier. So there's lots going on. So this idea of glacier structure or glacier anatomy is important, not only just in its own right that you need to know what the labels mean, but because that structure, that anatomy of the glacier is really important as one of the factors that influences for us what we're seeing in the geomorphology as we start to look at that over the next few weeks. So this week it's structure, superglacial, endglacial, basal ice layer, and then we'll move on and start thinking about, well, what's happening at the glacier bed, then looking at that in more detail, that feeds through to the geomorphology, which is what we're going to head on to next.